Martinez, welcome once again to another edition of Shaftesbury Society. Boy, do we have a timely discussion for you today. If you have gone out and taken a drive around North Carolina, tried to get groceries, go into a store, or anything like that, you know exactly what we're talking about today. You walk into a sandwich shop like I did a couple of days ago, and what you're likely to find is a sign that says dining room closed, or you'll find a harried owner trying to serve all the customers without enough people working. If you go to fill up your gas tank, you're going to find that it costs you a lot more per gallon, a little bit of sticker shock going on there. And also, if you go to the grocery store and you're used to just whatever you want, you just go to the right shelf and pick it up, no more. There are some empty shelves, but usually just spotty shelves. Things that we just took for granted to be there no longer are there. Where are they? Are they out in the LA port waiting on a container ship? Who knows? We're going to talk about all of that today with three experts in economics and finance and trade. Joining us today, our friend Scott Lincicome. He is Senior Fellow in Economic Studies for the Cato Institute. Scott writes frequently about finance, trade, manufacturing, really key issues when it comes to the economy. Also joining me is my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation, Paige Terryberry. If her name sounds new to you, get used to it. She is now a prolific writer and analyst here in fiscal and economic policy at the Locke Foundation, the fiscal policy analyst, and also our good friend, Dr. Mike Walden, recently retired from NC State University, now holding the title of William Neal Reynolds Professor Emeritus at NC State, still very active in analyzing economic issues for us. So welcome to you all. Thanks for being with us today. Mike, let's start with you. Give us your sense, if you would, kind of that 30,000-foot view of where you think we are with our economy.
We're past the worst. We had we were just getting out of the worst stage of the COVID-19 recession, which primarily was a second quarter 2020 event. We've been growing since then, not always as fast as we'd like, but growing since then. If we look at some of the big metrics like gross domestic product, we're almost back to where we were, or pretty much back to where we were pre-pandemic. The unemployment rate is down, but that's a little deceptive. It's around 4% both nationally here in North Carolina, but it's a little bit deceptive, and I think it's probably going to be something we're going to talk about in depth later, because it does not account for the fact that we don't have as many people in the labor market. People have literally dropped out. A lot of people have dropped out of the labor market, meaning they don't have a job or they're not looking for work. Labor force participation rate is down 2 percentage points from what it was pre-pandemic. In North Carolina, that translates into 90,000 fewer people in the labor market. And I think that's one of the factors that's going into some of these supply shortages. I think we're now beginning to confront some of the questions based on what the federal government did during the pandemic, i.e. infused a lot of money into the economy based on problems that are still lingering from COVID with respect to supply constraints. Federal Reserve, I always tell people, watch the Federal Reserve. They don't get a lot of attention sometimes. They don't get front page attention. They're very, very crucial. They were a big actor in this, the anti-recession efforts by the federal government, and they're now looking at pulling back. That could have a big, big impact on things like interest rates, employment, unemployment rate, et cetera. So I think we're sort of in a transition phase from where we're hopefully have the pandemic and the virus under control, although who knows, another variant could pop up, but we've got good numbers on the Delta infections going down. So I think we're in a transition phase where increasingly COVID's going to be in our rearview mirror, but now we're going to transfer to dealing with some of these problems that I think are lingering and will linger, that were based on both COVID and how, in terms of public policy, the federal government primarily reacted to those problems.
Scott, how do you see it? Transition past the worst as Mike sees it, or what's your view?
No, I tend to agree. It seems that the worst is behind us, both economically and in terms of COVID, thank goodness. But we're dealing with a lot of friction. There's a lot of sand in the gears. And some of that is COVID related. I mean, if you look at supply chains, for example, I mean, it's like constant source of news these days about chips bobbing offshore in Los Angeles or on the East Coast as well, in Savannah and Charleston and elsewhere. A lot of that is just a mismatch between supply and demand patterns. These global supply chains developed over decades over relatively predictable patterns of supply and demand. And all of a sudden you have countries, entire economies shutting down and reopening and then shutting down again. And you have outbreaks at factories or at ports. And at the same time, you have changes in long-term demand patterns. Mike mentioned government stimulus. We have put a lot of money into the economy, but a lot of other countries have done that as well. And Americans in particular have become much more comfortable with shopping online and buying goods in particular. We seem to be wanting to buy more goods. So all of that is pushing against a supply chain that just wasn't designed for it. And that is, I think, a major source of friction that's playing out. Another big one's in the labor market. There's a geographic mismatch. You have certain economies that are going gangbusters, but others like downtown urban areas where a lot of people live still aren't fully rebounded. I was just up in DC a couple of weeks ago, and it's pretty sleepy compared to Raleigh. And people who work in Washington and used to have a job, maybe waiting tables or whatever, aren't going to have the employment opportunities of places maybe in the suburbs or in other places that are economies are more booming. And so that type of friction is going to continue. And there are plenty of others. Childcare, I think, is another one that's a potential problem. A lot of daycare centers are having difficulty finding workers. Well, if you can't get childcare, then you can't go to work. So that breeds as well. So as all of these frictions slowly work themselves out, the hope is that the labor market will normalize and the economy will normalize. But as I just wrote in my column last week for the Dispatch, there are some reasons to be, I think, a little more concerned that these labor shortages aren't going to be as transitory as we think. We've seen a really substantial uptick in retirements. We're about 3.5 million above trend at this point. We have still major backlogs in immigration, and legal visa issuance is down about 1 million from where it should be. And we have about 9 million more immigrants waiting in line for these visas. And then, for all of the other COVID and non-COVID reasons, there could be simply life decisions. People have reassessed. Maybe they want to spend more time at home with family in a 2-earner household. Maybe they have a bigger financial cushion because they got a lot of money from the government, but also they're not spending as much on things they used to do, like going on vacation or putting miles on the car. So you combine those things and there might be some simple lifestyle changes as well. So I think that's going to put, even though a lot of these frictions I do think are temporary, I'm also concerned that some of these labor shortages are going to be a lot longer term than we think.
Interesting, Paige, that Scott's using the word frictions and Mike's using the word, transition. How do you see it? It just seems kind of strange to me. I'm not an economist, but I can't recall experiencing anything like this with real world stuff like I described at the top of this. You go to try to buy a certain type of toilet paper and it's not there. And that's a new one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm certainly encouraged by these gentlemen's positivity that this is a transition and things are behind us. I will say, from a North Carolina voter perspective, we, as you know, put out a poll last week. 63% of North Carolina voters are still discouraged and say that the economy is getting worse. So it certainly is new. This type of shortage is certainly different from what we saw at the beginning of COVID, where the shortage was from hoarding. Now we're seeing shortage from supply chains and the downstream effects of these COVID closures.
Paige, that's such an important point about the Civitas poll from last week. Mike and Scott, so is there a disconnect between how people are viewing things? It's very negative viewpoint from people about the economy, yet you two are saying, well, we're kind of moving out of it. So what's going on here?
Well, I think obviously most people have other occupations, an economist or fiscal analysts, et cetera. Thank goodness they're doing the real work that needs to be done. And so they don't look at things the same way we do. And there's a lot to be concerned about, just not only supplies backed up, but inflation. That's probably one of the top concerns. We got very used to almost non-existent inflation for much of the 21st century due to a variety of factors, globalization being a top one. We had many years of inflation that was between 0 and 0.5%, and now we're looking at annualized rates of between 5 and 6%. There's a debate among economists and others about whether that's temporary or whether that's longer run. And it's been interesting to me, Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, had been on board of the side that said, oh, this is temporary, it's going to go away, maybe another 6 months. He's now changing his tune. He's now saying, this might be deeper, which is my opinion also. So I think people have, and then of course the labor situation. If you are, especially if you're a small business person working in sectors like hospitality and leisure and maybe personal services, you can't find people to work. And hopefully we get back to this, because this is interesting. Some demographers have been arguing that we're going to be facing a permanent labor shortage in the years ahead due to the fact that we're not simply having as many babies. The birth rate is way down. People are marrying later, et cetera. So we could come back to that later. But I think there's certainly reasons why people are concerned. They look at their current economy and they don't like what they see, because I think a lot of folks thought that, well, once we get through COVID, look, we can deal with COVID. We'll hunker down. We understand that. But when COVID is in the rearview mirror, we expect things to go back to where they were, and they are not going back to where they were.
I tend to agree with Mike on all of that, particularly the part about, thank goodness not everybody's an economist. But the fact is that we're looking 6 months, a year down the road, and individual consumers and employers and workers are looking right now, or in fact, they're looking in the last, their rearview mirror for the last month. And the fact is that you're right. We've become accustomed to not just modest inflation, but abundance. I mean, the ability to point and click and get something on your doorstep a day later, the ability to go to any store and have not just what you want, but 87 types of what you want, right? And all of that is just a little messed up right now. And, it's not, a lot of people want to point, oh, this is globalization and all this, but its domestic supply chains are just as mucked up as the global ones. You mentioned toilet paper. Most of our toilet paper is actually made domestically. Fact is, though, it uses and food as well. 90% or more of our food is made domestically, farmed domestically, and manufactured here. So those same frictions that are affecting the global supply chains are often affecting the domestic ones, whether it's worker shortages or factory closures, or you name it. And so those things we tend to take it for granted that those things are just going to work seamlessly. It's all going to be, beautiful Hayekian cooperation. But in the real world, of course, especially right now, it ain't happening like that. And I think the other thing is, our political leaders do deserve some of the blame here. That, in February, as vaccines were starting to proliferate, I mean, it was supposed to be, that's it. It's over, right? Everything's going to be perfect. Everything going back. And this goes not just, the Biden administration, but the Fed as well. And a lot of policymakers out there really didn't anticipate that there would still be all this sand in the gears. Now, of course, 2020 hindsight is a thing. And so, it's easy to look back and say, aha, we should have known that there would be these types of problems. We should have known that we would still have some labor issues. But regardless, they're clearly still with us. And the hope is that they will slowly taper off into early to mid next year.
Well, speaking of labor shortage, I'm reading and hearing a lot of stories these days about the truck driver shortage. So even if all of those container ships that are out there, whether it's Savannah or Charleston or Los Angeles, waiting to be able to come up to the dock and get unloaded and all that, unloaded into what and driven by whom? Now, for me, I'm from a truck driving family. My father and my brother, that's how they supported us, is driving long haul and short haul as well. So now I've always had an appreciation for that. But I think most of us, if you're driving on Interstate 40 or Interstate 85 and you pass a tractor trailer, all you're thinking is, get out of my way. I don't like you being that close to me, not realizing that what's inside is headed for the store shelf the next day. Now people are suddenly getting appreciation for that.
Yeah, and there appear to be several things at play with the trucker shortage, which I agree with you is very real. In fact, there certainly we have issues with port efficiency and we have issues with other links in the supply chain. But if you talk to the experts right now, it really appears that the trucker shortage is probably the weakest link in the chain, and because it's causing containers to essentially pile up at the port. So the ports are getting them off the ships, these containers, but nobody's being able to pick them up, and there are a lot of issues and backlogs, and that kind of, again, ripples through the chain. And it appears that, the trucking industry is really having difficulty recruiting younger workers to replace older workers because they've seen a wave of retirements, people in their 50s and older. You combine that with, quite frankly, as I've written, we have some very misguided policies, I think, that play into this. For starters, we have this thing called the Jones Act, which essentially prohibits or makes it very cost prohibitive to ship goods from U.S. port to U.S. port. So let's say you want to take some oranges from Florida up to Boston. Well, the Jones Act says that you have to use an American-made ship to do that. That makes shipping quite expensive. Nobody does it. So what happens? You have more stuff going by truck up I-95 on those oranges example. It puts more pressure on your trucking and your rail capacity that we could be using right now. We also have not implemented commitments under the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, that would allow Mexican trucking companies to operate in the United States. And again, providing kind of a relief valve there. And then there's issues related to hours of service regulation and the federal regulations, CDL, commercial driver's license changes that caused some retirements. And you add all these things up, and it just, again, it's not, I don't think it's the cause, but it just it exacerbates, I think, the problem.
Let me add something real quick here. I don't want to page up. I'm sorry, we're not giving you time to take a breath. Let me add something real fast. And that is, I think regarding labor shortage, I think there are two things to keep in mind here. Yes, we do have a shortage of labor in some areas, and Scott's mentioned trucking. Of course, trucking, I think, has had a labor shortage for a long time, but there's some issues there. Another thing I think we're seeing, though, is a reallocation of labor. There's some sense, we don't have real hard data on this, I'll first admit. There's some sense, though, that last year, 2020, when a lot of people were furloughed, but they had financial support, primarily from the federal government. They had time on their hands. Instead of just sitting on the couch and playing video games, we think that a lot of folks, particularly young folks, said, you know what, I'm going to use this time to upskill myself. I'm going to use this time to move on to a better job. I'm not going to go back to that other job. And if you look at just North Carolina statistics, you see that there are several sectors now where employment is well above what it was pre-pandemic. There are sectors where it's still very much below pre-pandemic levels, hospitality, leisure, and personal services. So I think, like with a lot of things, the pandemic compressed trends that would have taken 5 to 10 years to happen into 1 year. I think this is one of them, where we're beginning to see people making decisions to change their skill set and take on different jobs, and that's leaving the labor market looking much different than it did pre-pandemic.
Yeah, and here in the Triangle, the example that I often give is, if you look at that gleaming Amazon facility out near Garner, right? So warehousing has been booming, of course, during the e-commerce era. Well, so you can get a pretty well-paying job at Amazon. I mean, starting is 15 plus benefits, $15 an hour. But you can go well into the $20 an hour range doing kind of blue-collar warehousing and logistics work. And that's gonna pull workers from other sectors that were going, maybe leisure and hospitality or whatever, pre-pandemic. You combine that with, again, some of these longer term changes, and it is, as Mike said, it's going to put pressure on particularly smaller businesses that can't just match Amazon's pay scale and are struggling to recruit.
Yeah, just one quick point, just to continue on what Scott was saying with the Jones Act and some of these unfair policies. There's an unusually high demand for truckers right now, and no supply, can't get them to work. And there's unionization going on, as well as emissions laws. So half the truckers in California actually can't operate in other parts of the state. My colleague John Sanders writes about this. The law requires truckers to meet standards that the majority of American trucks just can't meet. And so that is causing a huge bottleneck in California that's further gumming up the ports by the state's stringent emission laws on those trucks.
Yeah, California is really a unique animal, and a lot of it does go back to the regulatory environment. The other one that I read just recently is really onerous zoning rules surrounding the ports of LA and Long Beach prevent port trucking companies from stacking containers more than too high, which again, when containers we're overflowing with containers, that would be a relatively easy fix. And apparently the city governments out there just waived these zoning rules, but this has been a problem for months and months and months. And it apparently took just a little too much attention for them to finally act. And of course, those zoning rules will snap right back once the crisis has passed.
Sure. And sorry, go ahead.
Go
Donna.
ahead, Paige.
I was just going to say some of the ports, the Port of Los Angeles, for example, is government owned and unionized. And this makes it, much more difficult. Contractors may be willing to work and be turned away from those jobs.
Yeah. And in fact, that's something I wrote about. It's really frustrating. When you look at the history of US port operations and modernization, you see time and time again that the unions on both the West Coast and the East Coast, so the ILWU on the West Coast, ILA on the East and the Coast and the Gulf. So these unions have not only negotiated rather high salaries, good for them, but really inflexible work schedules. And I think perhaps the biggest issue is they've vehemently resisted automation of these ports. So the United States has some of the least efficient ports in the world. And I'm not talking about in the developed world. I'm talking about in the world, lower than ports in Africa and the Middle East as well. Now, again, during the good times, this isn't a problem. The United States, believe it or not, doesn't trade as much as a share of our GDP as a lot of people think. We're not as dependent on trade as a lot of countries or places like Singapore. But in the bad times, it's that type of efficiency that we could really stand to use, that type of flexibility. And unfortunately, it's all tied up in years and years of foot dragging.
So what do you do if you are the small to medium-sized business owner, the sandwich shop that I referenced in the beginning of our forum here? And this is a true story. There's one near my house, and I go there about once a week, and they haven't been able to open their dining room during peak hours in several months now. They simply don't have the people. But what do you do if you're in that position and you're trying to compete, yet the value of the job that you need to fill really isn't $15, $16, $17 an hour plus benefits? What do you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing you could do is go ahead and bite the bullet and say, I'm going to have to offer more. And if I was in that position as an owner manager of a business like a sandwich shop, and I pay people more to get them to work so I can actually stay in business, I would somehow communicate that to my customers, either directly or subtly, because I think customers need to know that. Because
are you talking about price increases then?
Yeah, because you're going to have to pass it on to the customers in terms of price increases. Two other things, though. One would be to look at automation and technology. I was in a fast food restaurant a couple of weeks ago in Virginia. Went in, my wife and I went in. We were going to get some drinks on the way home, and there's no one at the counter. No one at the counter. Instead, we were confronted with this big kiosk. Probably took us 15 minutes to figure out how to use it, but we did. And that's a wave, I think, of the future. And in fact, this was talked about even before the pandemic. And then the third thing is for managers, particularly, to look at their staff and look at what they're expecting their staff to do and say, can I reorganize the tasks? Can I streamline? Can I economize? And I think this is something that a lot of businesses don't do when times are good, because times are good, but now that times are hard, and particularly labor is hard to get, try to figure out, is there some way I can introduce some efficiencies? But I think those are the three things I would recommend to small businesses in particular to try to get through this.
You know, I've seen some examples of the automation, the kiosk. I've seen it in several different places. But again, if you're small or maybe medium size, is this really just going to be survival of the fittest here in a very different marketplace?
Yeah, and it's, of course, it's something you don't install overnight. I mean, I think McDonald's, that I mentioned, this was a McDonald's restaurant we were in. I think they've been playing with this for several years. They've tested it in other markets. So we're just probably would have come even without the pandemic. But if you're a small, maybe a one-stop restaurant, coffee shop, whatever, yeah, you don't have that expertise. You don't have those funds probably available to do this. So you're going to have to rely on the other two short-term measures, but long-term, I think we're going to see leisure hospitality employ more automation and more technology.
Pretty interesting. You know, Paige, I thought it was fascinating that one of the things that you wrote a few days ago was about the issue of inflation. You know, Mike mentioned, okay, well, it may cost more to buy that sandwich, you know, if that business owner is going to have to raise prices. But you wrote about the fact that it does come with higher wages and an increase in pension checks. So for some people looking at this, they're on kind of the receiving end and viewing this whole inflation labor market thing as positive for them.
Absolutely, and it appears positive at first, but the inflation can actually eat up a salary increase. So your dollar is still not going as far. But yeah, as far as the pension checkpoint, so at the national level, the Social Security Administration, because the COLA, the cost of living adjustment rate, is tied to inflation, they determined they were going to raise the pension rate by about 5.9%. And so now some at the state level are calling for state pension plans to also increase accordingly. So North Carolina doesn't have a budget yet, so we'll see if that's in there. But just another way that that inflation is affecting folks. Just back to what Dr. Walden was saying about automation, and how this your hypothetical small business would deal with these issues. You know, some restaurants are decreasing their menu items entirely. A survey showed that 20% of or menus have gotten smaller by 20% just to kind of cut out and create a higher profit margin for ordering less ingredients. Some companies are repackaging things so that they can give a customer something new, but for the same price or for a higher price. Some restaurants are even choosing to decrease portion sizes.
The shrinking bun effect.
Right. Which, you know, you have to be careful because customers will react to that. But just another kind of crazy way that some small businesses might be forced to have to cut costs.
You know, Scott, earlier you mentioned the issue of retirements, and I actually know someone who is an example of that. This person is in their early 60s, and it dawned on the person that, hey, well, why, since everything is so messed up here, and I don't want to go back to doing what I was doing, why don't I just start taking that Social Security check at age 62?
Yeah. And the other thing I think that's really driving some of these retirements, I mean, other than COVID and safety concerns, is the asset values. You know, people's houses, particularly if you're living around here, your houses have gone up in value. Your stock portfolio, let's say you have a 401k, has done really well over the last few years. So I think, you know, there's at least anecdotally, and if you look at some of the data we have now on the people who aren't looking for a job, and it's a lot of people above the age of 55, and they've done that and for a host of reasons that just mentioned. I think the big question for economists, for labor economists, is, are those folks going to return to the labor market? Or are they just out? Are they just moving to Florida and done? And we just really don't know. I'm kind of the view that I think this is going to be more permanent. I think we've seen kind of a psychological shift, but you know, the reasonable minds can differ there, and we're going to just have to wait and see.
So if you think about this, though, okay, people are retiring at a younger age, at least some are. But then, Mike, I think you mentioned the birth rate being down. So if you play this out a few years, where are the next generation of workers and taxpayers going to come from?
Well, that's a good question, because as I mentioned when I brought this up, demographers have been talking about this for a long time. They've been talking because these are trends. This is something that didn't pop up just for COVID. These are trends that with our pyramid, our age pyramid is getting thicker at the top, where the older people like me, above 70, are, and it's getting skinnier at the bottom. And of course, the older people retire and move on, and the younger people are the ones that we require, that we depend upon to be workers. And the demographers have seen this coming. So again, I think it's one of those trends that COVID just made more intense. COVID really didn't create it. Although I do think there are a lot of people, I know my colleagues at NC State in my department, I think if you include me, we had 4 or 5 people who retired last year during COVID. And I think it was a combination. Well, in my case, I worked 43 years, I turned 70, so it was time to move on. But I do think COVID caused many people who could retire or close to retirement to really rethink their life and say, gosh, I don't want this to be, I want to enjoy myself. But beyond that, yeah, I think we do. If you look at the nation as an aggregate, you can see it in the numbers, how the numbers are coming. We're going to have fewer people going to colleges. Colleges, I think, are probably going to face a crisis in terms of not having enough students 15 or 20 years down the road. Now, North Carolina, if we focus this on North Carolina has been a state that has been able to continue to grow faster than other states, not because we necessarily have a higher birth rate or a lower death rate. It's because people are moving here. For several years, we have been among the top states in something called net in-migration, which simply doesn't account immigrants from foreign countries. This is just looking at people who move around within the country. My wife and I are both net immigrants from 40 years ago. But North Carolina is, we rival in some years of Florida, for example, and Arizona in terms of that net rate of people coming in versus moving out. So we may have a better situation here in North Carolina if we can keep bringing people in who are working, coming in. But I do think nationally, this is going to be a problem. And what may be the savior here is automation and technology, something that I was looking, North Carolina State University has this, this, Donna, has this group called the Emerging Issues Forum, where they put on a conference every year that is supposed to be illuminating issues that are here and coming down the road, but sort of get a jump on it. And I was looking at 5 years ago, the concern or the focus of the Emerging Issues Forum was how technology is going to destroy jobs. And where are those people going to get work? Is there going to be new work for them? And now we're thinking about the reverse, that we don't have enough people. And so it's interesting how things can come full circle. And it may be that all this technology, this labor-saving technology that's being developed, continue to be developed, that may actually be needed if we do have this dearth of new workers coming.
We're getting some interesting comments and questions on Facebook. Let's go through a couple of those because I'd love to have the reaction of the panel to this. Here's one from Stuart. Why does the baby boomer depend on young people to be taxpayers? Is it because they have to fund Social Security for the old folks? If so, let's move away from Social Security and move toward private 401k. Problem solved.
Well, there's certainly some truth to that in the sense that our Social Security system is designed where current workers are paying for retirees. And when you have a top-heavy demographics, with a lot of baby boomers and not as many of us Gen Xers and below, there's certainly some truth to that. Cato has for decades been warning about this exact demographic situation and has been proposing private accounts a transition to private accounts to try to solve for it. The math does work, but the politics are really brutal. The President George W. Bush tried, at least he sort of tried, and the political backlash was substantial. And it's unfortunate because if you actually look at the performance of the markets since then, everybody was warning, people will be at the whims of the markets, they could lose their fortunes and all this. If you actually look at the market performance since over the last 20 years, it's been pretty darn great, and that was always the argument for private accounts is that over a long period of time, which is what retirement, you're supposed to invest over a 30-year or more window. It's not exactly foolproof, but it's pretty darn safe. If you, particularly given that accounts would be limited, you wouldn't be, speculating on GameStop or whatever. But unfortunately, getting the politics to shift on that is a different animal. I'm hopeful that again that some of the demographic issues we're facing right now and the market performance as well will provide a new reason for us to look at this. But it's I don't think it's on anybody's front burner right now. And I would just add one other thing though. What Mike was saying about automation. I totally agree, and I think that the extent to which we can automate and increase productivity, that'll be higher wages, and that's great, except robots don't pay taxes and don't have babies, and there's a very willing pool of workers in other countries that are dying to come here and contribute economically. I mentioned the over 1 million visa holders in backlog right now, and 9 million more. So there's plenty of people who want to come and live and work in the country, and I think we should welcome them.
And of course, that gets us into a whole different conversation. Maybe we can have that one day. The difference between legal immigration and reforms needed there and illegal immigration, which we all hear about what's happening at the southern border, and then the difference of what's going on at the northern border. But we'll save that intense discussion for another day. On Facebook, Ken is wanting to know, is there some sort of way, would it be wise perhaps to somehow incent the elderly to get back into the marketplace, into the labor market?
Oh, sure. I mean, I have lots of friends who retired and they set out for a year and they were bored, and now they're back working. In fact, I'm working. I'm just working in a different way as a private consultant and speaker, et cetera. But yeah, and Scott mentioned with the Social Security issue, there's some disincentives in Social Security for that you're taxed on earnings above a certain level. So if we wanted to do that, yes, we could change some rules there. And on that matter of Social Security, I could not agree more with Scott. I'm a big fan of private accounts. I'm a big fan of index funds for long run investing, et cetera. But I also agree with you, Donna. George W. Bush spent a lot of political capital on that in 2005, didn't go anywhere. So I'm not hopeful. I think for the questioner who wanted to know where Social Security is going, I think probably what's going to happen is we're going to have a rerun of the Greenspan Commission in 1983. In 1983, Social Security was up against the wall. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. We've got about 10 years maybe before we're there again. 10 years is a political eternity. I predict that probably around 2031, 2032, the writing will be on the wall in the face of politicians, and we'll have another Greenspan type commission, won't be headed by Greenspan. And CBO put out a very interesting paper 5-6 years ago. I think it was over 60 ways to change Social Security. I mean, keep the system, but tweak it in various ways in order to make it solvent again. And that's my prediction of what's going to happen. We'll have another version of the Greenspan Commission. There'll be some tweaks in Social Security, and that'll give it another 20 or 30 years of life.
I think our big challenge there is that we have a lot of people who highly value security. And even though some of these options to change the system, to reform the system, still come with a high level of security, people get nervous. That brings me to something else I want to get the discussion going on, and that is the fact that we've had so much money auto-deposited into people's checking accounts. Now, are we in a position where that has built an expectation and a sense of security that a lot of people like? What does that mean for the future? Paige, you have thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, going back to the jobs and incentives, this money is just creating more of a dependency on government. If you look at the Build Back Better plan that President Biden has working in Washington, it's a job killer. It's going to tax work implicitly and explicitly through corporation taxes, pass-through businesses, and then also subsidizing everything under the sun. And so that's one discouraging thing that's going on.
Not to
Yeah,
mention,
I agree with that. If you look, a paper was published, I think, 2 weeks ago from the University of Chicago, the Becker, excuse me, the Friedman Becker Institute. Oh, frog. The Friedman Becker Institute published a paper that estimated that the enhanced child care credits that the Biden administration has been ongoing for several months. It's a big part of the social infrastructure package that, if it's passed and includes that, it'll extend even more. The Becker Friedman Institute and the University, anything out of the University of Chicago, you should look at. I mean, it is probably the top economics program in the country. They estimated that that if that extended and enhanced child tax care credit becomes permanent, it will kill about 1.5 million jobs. Yeah. In fact, I think they actually say it's responsible right now for 1.5 million jobs going begging. So, and I think I also saw a statistic that said that, with everything that's gone over the last year or two, 50% of Americans, 50% now are dependent upon government in some way financially. And that's up from 10%, I think, in the 1980s, an enormous increase. So yeah, I do worry about, there are lots of things I think we can do to ensure that even if we have a demographic issue, that we can encourage people, the people who are here, encourage them to work. And I think there's a fear I have that that it looks like we're headed in the other direction of enabling programs that actually give people a disincentive to work.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say, that's, one of the frustrating things about the current debate about the past spending and Build Back Better is that everybody has kind of laser focused on just supplemental unemployment insurance, which is of course an important thing. It's certainly noteworthy given that there were about 30 to 40% of Americans who were actually making more on unemployment than they would have made in the workforce. So that's important. But when you focus that tightly on just that issue, you ignore the child tax credit change, which was substantial and went to anybody, job or no job, and far above middle class, and not to mention poor individuals and families. But then there's tons of other relief. Of course there were stimulus checks, there was rent relief, there were rent eviction moratoria at the national and at the state level, student loan relief, and you put all of this together. And this, again, as I wrote last week, it's given people a major financial cushion, and that's of course all fine and good for them. And maybe at the peak of a pandemic when vaccines weren't widely available, it was necessary for people to stay home, particularly when the governments had kind of shut down their livelihoods. But now that justification has all disappeared. And as Mike mentioned, it unfortunately seems that instead of pulling it back, we're now going to try to cement it as a long-term feature of the U.S. economy.
Well, the big question is who pays for it? Who pays for all this? I'm looking at the U.S. Debt Clock website right now. U.S. national debt, 28 trillion.
Yeah, well, that's of course part of the particular. I mean, it's mainly the Democrats, I'll say it, who are trying to figure this out. I'm all for a social safety net. I think we need a social safety net. There are people who, for a variety of reasons, can't. I don't want anyone to be starving and destitute on the street. But we want to have a social safety net that's, in my mind at least, that's temporary. And we want to have a social safety net that encourages independence and motivates people to, yes, they're going through a temporary bad time. My late father was a carpenter all his life. In winters, he would be laid off and he relied on unemployment compensation. That put food in my mouth as a youngster. But he didn't rely on it forever. When work came back, he went to work. So I think we always want to have a social safety net that motivates independence, motivates people to skill themselves for the kinds of jobs that are out there so that they can go back to work. And we want to withdraw that money at a rate, however, that's less than dollar for dollar with their earnings. So it does motivate them to work and not say, well, I'm just trading $1 for the other.
Interesting question coming in from Colleen about the issue of spending, asking this: how would a balanced budget help to get our country back on the right track with no debt? Are we anywhere near a balanced budget?
No, we're not, but Donna, and I'll, authors always push their books, and I've got two people here and an audience out there that maybe has not heard us. I published a book, or had a book published last year, called Real Solutions, Common Sense Answers to Our Most Pressing Problems. And it goes through all the major issues, from debt to taxes, immigration, healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually devised a plan in that book to gradually pay off the national debt over a long period of time. This is not going to happen overnight, but no one is even talking about a plan now. No one's even talking about that. And so kind of sort of like private Social Security, private retirement plans, I'm not optimistic we're going to hear about this anytime soon. But there is a way to do it if you put your mind to it.
Yeah,
go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, unfortunately, the way to do it is to reform entitlements, and that's political kryptonite. My colleagues here at Cato put out a study about a year ago looking at the real long-term drivers of the debt, and it is entitlements. You hear about things like foreign aid or defense spending, and those things matter, but the drivers are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the rest of our entitlement system. And people, unfortunately, it is the political will to reform those things. And now, it seems like it's bipartisan, just isn't there. And so while we can talk about, a few trillion here and a few trillion there in the CARES Act and in pandemic related spending, it's a drop in the bucket when you look at the chart on how this actually affects long-term debt projections, which are, again, all about we've made promises to Americans that just don't balance in terms of entitlements and how to pay for them.
And of course,
it's interesting
in the big Build Back Better, the 3.5 trillion or whatever it ends up being, expansion of Medicaid and Medicare, that's all part of it. So it's heading down that road even further.
But it's interesting, but you're bringing up the point, or Scott brought up the point, that people have almost become used to this, and you don't hear a lot of cry about the debt. I can remember in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president. He came in 2009. Of course, we were in the midst of the Great Recession, and he wanted a fiscal stimulus bill that would help bring the economy out of the recession. Actually, it was already coming out, but that's fine. That would help bring the economy out of the recession faster. And he told his advisors, you have to bring it in at under $1 trillion. And I think, what did it come in at? $800 billion. And of course, here, if you look over the last year, 18 months, the federal government has passed, all the money's not yet deployed. But if you look at all the fiscal stimulus bills in 2020 and then 2021, and we're not counting the two so-called infrastructure bills that are pending, it's $6 trillion. $6 trillion. And I read very, very little while this was going on. These were being passed. I mean, some people raised questions, but I do think the public has sort of lost their interest, the public abroad. I mean, obviously there are listeners of this conference who are concerned, but I think broadly, it's not an issue it's not a winning issue.
Well, I can tell you that Ed submitted this question. He's pretty concerned. He asked this: will the proposed huge federal spending programs increase the money supply and subsequently generate steep inflation?
Well, it all depends. I don't want to monopolize time, but I'll just throw this out. All depends on how it's financed. If the Federal Reserve gets involved, like they did with the $6 trillion, the Federal Reserve financed about at least half of that. How do they do that? They buy Treasury securities as investments. How do they pay for them? They create money, and that is the source. I think I'm a devotee of Milton Friedman's concerns about the money supply. If you jack up the money supply, you're going to engender more inflation. I think that is a big reason why. If we have the two infrastructure bills pass whatever amount, and a lot of it's financed by the Federal Reserve, we don't know because we don't know what's in the bills yet, then that will contribute to more inflation. Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about how closely North Carolina is or isn't tied to what's happening nationally. Obviously, 28 trillion in debt at the national level, but here we have to balance a budget in North Carolina. They're working on that right now. So, Paige, what does that mean for us? Are we just going to kind of be the island out there of fiscal restraint here in North Carolina while the feds go off and just, spend, 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 spend?
It's a great point, Donna. And like Dr. Walden was saying, those numbers at the federal level are so big that it's lost public support because those numbers don't mean anything to the average individual. They're so big. It's you replace a T with a B with a Z. It's absolutely huge. We don't know what we're working with. Luckily, in North Carolina, we have fiscal leadership that has been conservative in years past. We have leaders in the legislature that came together at the beginning of this budget season and agreed to a spending limit, which is one of the most beneficial things that they could have done to rein in some of that spending. And so that's definitely a positive.
So what do we do to move forward and try to get some sort of stability or normalcy back into the labor market and back into the supply chain? I mean, we're talking, you all follow these trends and very carefully. So what do we need to do to turn it around, Scott?
Well, I mentioned the immigration point, so I'll leave that one aside for now. But I think, more broadly, I would like a broad discussion of how trade-offs do exist in a lot of these economic policies. It seems that over the last year plus, the new narrative is that debt doesn't matter, that social spending has no bad effects. It doesn't discourage employment, that all of the economics literature saying the otherwise is wrong, that because there's one study out there doing something like that. So I think, the starting point is to reassert that, look, trade-offs are real, that the child tax credit certainly provides money to needy individuals and children, but at the same time, it can discourage work, and that can be critically important for families and for the labor supply as well. Pushing back on those narratives, I think, is a critical point. On the corporate tax side, it's essential to note that corporations don't pay taxes, that those taxes will be passed on to consumers and to workers or to shareholders. And that, again, that this is not just a free, this isn't just free money, right? And as noted,
we're hearing, it's paid for. So.
Right, of course. But it's that type of common sense economics education that really seems to be missing a lot these days. That there are no negative consequences of anything. Everything's fine. We can spend forever and tax forever, and everything will be great. I'm hoping that some sanity seeps back in. But I got to say, the congressional Republicans have been distracted oftentimes on a lot of these issues and really haven't been laser focused. They seem to be more focused today than they were, say, 3-4 months ago, but still there needs to be, I think, more focus on the negative implications of these massive bills that are now pending, and of course on the massive ones that have already been passed.
I'll add 2 points. One, we need to discredit modern monetary theory, MMT. That's really the academic backstop for what the Biden administration is doing. And in a nutshell, it says, doesn't matter if you borrow money from the future, it's going to increase productivity. We're going to pay we're going to have more tax revenues in the future, and it'll take care of itself. So MMT needs to be further exposed and I think criticized. In terms of the supply chain, I think we need to look more closely at our broad educational system, and I'll just use North Carolina as an example. This is not, I wish I had come up with this term. The shelf life of training is becoming shorter. That is to say, the economy is changing so rapidly. What we need people to do is changing so rapidly that if you get a 4-year college degree, you likely won't continue to work in that all your life. And in fact, some of the statistics show that half of the college graduates coming out of 4-year college don't even take a job in their field. So I think we need to look at our educational system and make sure we have room for systems that allow quick training. By quick training, I mean a semester, 2 semesters. We need more apprenticeships. And I think that will help us adjust not just to the supply chain challenges we have today, but the ones that we're going to have in the future.
Yeah.
And I think we need to, and this probably is going to sound weird coming from someone who's spent over 4 decades in higher education. Not everyone should be going to 4-year colleges. I think we got too many people in 4-year colleges. We need people going to more 2-year colleges and even shorter than that, 1 semester and 2 semesters, and then get them out working, not giving them a pass to spend 6, 7 years in 4-year college partying, et cetera, and then coming out with a lot of debt. That model just doesn't work.
And I just jump on one thing Mike said. I totally agree, particularly on the adjustment point. I'm actually working on a new paper now talking about all the different ways that government policy over the last few decades has dramatically slowed our economy's ability to adjust to various shocks. So in the labor market or entrepreneurship or geographic mobility, where we are more rooted, and a lot of policy is actually rooting us even more. So occupational licensing, housing regulation, there's criminal justice, and there's a whole host of these policies out there that not only don't help with adjustment, whether it's training and education or other things, but actually make it more difficult for people to adjust. And, the supply chains are a great example of how that's rearing its ugly head right now. You have policies that have kind of made a inefficient, inflexible system that could really use some efficiency and flexibility right at this very moment. Unfortunately, you can't just snap your fingers like President Biden tried to do with the 24/7 port operation. Look, that's great, but it's just not going to do what, you need systemic root and branch reform of these things, not an overnight fix.
Paige, I know that you are watching carefully to see not only when it comes to the budget that's being negotiated right now in North Carolina, but other issues, and Scott mentioned some of them, occupational licensing, et cetera, that you are watching to see where North Carolina could be a leader, not only among the states, but hopefully some of the folks in Washington, D.C. might take notice to some of the principles that are being followed here and understand there's a reason that this state has been leading and has been a model in so many different ways when it comes to economic and budget policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the spending restraint is one of them that we all wish that Congress would get along with. Another one is our hold on, I lost my thought. One moment. Oh, yes. The corporate tax is what I was going to say. So one big part of the Build Back Better agenda is the harsh treatment of business. And, they say it's just business, but that does trickle down, and that cost is in labor and in people's smaller paychecks, less jobs. North Carolina has pitched the idea in one of our budget proposals of phasing out the corporate income tax entirely. North Carolina is a business leader in our area. We're the 10th most business-friendly state in the nation, and we're proud to be. And those types of reforms and ideas are what bring people to the state and foster that type of productivity.
Well,
I do hope oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, I do hope we start leading on licensing, because as much as I'm a transplant like Mike, although only a decade ago, but we, as great as the state's fiscal policy has been over the last decade or so, we're still lagging on licensing, and that is a huge barrier to occupational mobility and to attract new residents to the state. And states like Arizona have adopted just a simple reciprocity system where a license from one state is good in another state. That simple change alone would make a huge difference for getting the workers and getting the population that is going to be, given those demographic challenges, so essential in the coming years.
So it is possible to move forward and get things on the right track again, but it does take the political will, as we know, to get some of this done. So that's the big question mark here. Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Scott Lincicome, Paige Terryberry, and Mike Walden. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
And
Thank
thank
you.
you for also being part of this. We really appreciate that every week you are joining us to make sure that you are informed on what's happening here. We hope that we're bringing you the information and the topics that you find to be important and timely. We'd love to hear back from you, get your feedback on some of what we're doing here. And also, I'd like to ask you to consider this. If you do like what's happening here at the Locke Foundation and our journalism arm, Carolina Journal, we'd ask you to support us. We are a nonprofit organization. We do rely on tax-deductible donations from people just like you. If you are so inclined, we would greatly appreciate it. Really fast, really secure, simple to do. Just go to johnlocke.org, and in the upper right-hand corner, there's a Donate tab. Just click on that. It'll take you right to the page to be able to make that tax-deductible donation to help fuel the work, freedom, economic opportunity here in North Carolina. On behalf of the entire team here at the Locke Foundation, thank you so much for joining us. Come back again next week for another discussion here at Shaftesbury Society. Have a